Resident Evil 1.5 is the unofficial name given to the game that was being worked on before Resident Evil 2. It was very different from Resident Evil 2, as Claire Redfield wasn't even featured in it. Instead, there was a character named Elza Walker who never even crossed paths with Chris. The character models were different, the zombies behaved differently. It was basically a totally different game. It even had RPG-style equipment that would increase your defense and stats. Resident Evil was originally supposed to be a first-person shooter. Fortunately, Capcom and Shinji Mikami didn't think that the first-person shooter genre handled horror very well. Remember, this was in the PlayStation 1 era. The only sorts of shooters were Doom or, at its best, GoldenEye. They redid the game to be more like Alone in the Dark, more an adventure game than a shooter, while still retaining plenty of enemies to kill. It was this strange combination of elements that created the survival horror genre, thank goodness. After Resident Evil 2, Capcom decided that they would work on two separate Resident Evil games at the exact same time. Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil Nemesis. Nemesis was supposed to be a spin-off game which recapped the events leading up to Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 3 was supposed to continue the story utilizing a next-generation graphics engine. Unfortunately, Capcom had entered into an exclusive contract with Sony which forced them to release a numbered title on a Sony platform. Thus, Resident Evil Nemesis was branded as Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and Resident Evil 3 became Resident Evil Code Veronica on Dreamcast. The Sega Saturn version of Resident Evil 1 actually had a lot more content featured in it than the PlayStation version did. There was a second Tyrant. Hunter Alphas changed for the Sega Saturn 2. After clearing the courtyard, Saturn players got to grapple instead with Tick characters whose insect-like bodies included sickled arms for slicing the player to bits, and as you're watching now, a very tough-to-kill zombie version of Albert Wesker. From the beginning, Capcom planned for Resident Evil to be multiplayer, to support 2 players instead of 1, allowing partners to assist each other and help each other while killing the undead horde in a 2-pronged affair. This less daunting version of the game was nixed early on due to hardware limitations. In 2008, Resident Evil's lackluster script was recognized by the Guinness World Records Gamers Edition with the honor of the worst game dialogue ever. A dubious honor that's only fitting for lines like,
"What is this all about? I can't figure it out at all."
To clear confusion, chronologically, this is how the Resident Evil games take place. I'm only covering the games because the movies is going to be a much longer list. It starts off with Resident Evil 0, then Resident Evil 1. Skip Resident Evil 2, and you play Resident Evil 3 from the very beginning until Jill makes it to the clock tower. Then Resident Evil 2 takes place. At the scene where Claire gives Sherry her jacket, that's when the 4th survivor, Hunk and Tofu scenes take place, while the rest of Resident Evil 2 is going on. Then Resident Evil Outbreak happens. Then Outbreak File 2. After Outbreak File 2, the rest of Resident Evil 3 finishes. After Resident Evil 3 finishes, then comes Resident Evil Survivor. After Resident Evil Survivor comes Resident Evil Gaiden for the Game Boy Color. Here comes Resident Evil Code Veronica. And then comes Resident Evil Dead Aim. Resident Evil Darkside Chronicles shortly comes after Dead Aim. Then comes Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles. Here is where everybody's favorite Resident Evil 4 takes place. After Resident Evil 4 is Resident Evil Revelations, then Resident Evil 5 with the Desperate Escape and the Lost in Nightmares. All of that takes place all at the same time in the chronological order that you play as in the game. Then Resident Evil Revelations 2, and finally that despicable Resident Evil 6. The original design documents for Resident Evil show a cast of characters different to those who appeared in the actual game. In addition to Chris and Jill, there was Gelzer, a large, bulky man with a cybernetic eye, and Dewey, who was actually inspired off of Eddie Murphy. He was supposed to be the comic relief character of Resident Evil. Resident Evil pays several homages to the British rock band Queen and can be found scattered throughout the games, particularly in reference to their 15th and final studio album called Made in Heaven. After Capcom's success with Resident Evil in 1996, they made the decision to try and port it to other consoles. One such instance was for the Game Boy Color, which Capcom entrusted to Hot Gen Studios, a company based in the United Kingdom. Soon after the finished product was sent to Capcom, it was rejected and never released. The official statement on behalf of the company claimed that they were not confident that the product would have made both consumers and Capcom happy. That's it for these 10 facts, guys. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something new, and thank you so much for watching. Make sure to leave a like if there is something new that you learned. Naughty Dog saw this and thought it would be funny if they turned it into a character. There's the creation of